Meow! Opal's cat. The Canadian Nuclear Society was formed in 1999 from the Canadian Nuclear Association. The Canadian Nuclear Association is a bunch of private companies who are there to promote the use of nuclear power. I think peaceful use of nuclear power. And the Canadian Nuclear Society split off from them, and it's more scientific, and they look at future developments, and their mission is to spread the good word for nuclear power. So I've been interested in nuclear power for a long time. I was born and raised very close to a place called Windscale in Cumbria, England, which is now called Sellafield, that has had a few issues over the years. So I've always been around nuclear power and interested in it. And I did find out some interesting things on this particular conference, which I'm going to share with you guys now. So hold on tight, admire my certificate. I really didn't know I was getting one. And let's talk about Canadian nuclear power and American. So one of my prepping goals in 2019 was to attend more actual information conferences and courses to upskill myself in various areas that may or may not be related to an SHTF, that may or may not happen. And I'm really pleased I attended this one, and I got way more out than I was expecting. So what we had were 3 lecturers, 2 guys on the first day and a lady on the second day. And what they have is scientific backgrounds. They also had a guest lecturer there who actually came and talked to us as well, quite often, just to clarify stuff, who's also a scientist. So they're all PhD level, though I think the lady may be a master's in biology. I'm not sure, wasn't quite listening. But the rest of them are certainly PhDs in physics and other PhDs on top of that. And they've been around and involved in the peaceful application of Canadian nuclear plants for an awful long time. And the CANDU reactor has been exploited all across the world, and Canada's a world leader in this. And I just want to give you a little bit of history and show you what we were doing. So this is the workbook we got, and as you can see, it's based on most of the slides, and I did in fact write notes. There's some interesting stuff. So the 3 units of the course are actually what is nuclear energy. And that was pretty basic, and I knew most of it, but some of it was interesting, what Canada's done, what Canada's planning to do. Issues and answers, that's more directed at, if I'm asked by a member of the public, isn't nuclear power going to kill everybody and isn't it evil, I'm supposed to, having done this course, be able to answer them honestly and say, no, it's the best thing since sliced bread. We'll get into that. And the other one is radiation and risk. Radiation risk was very unfortunate. The guy that does it is actually an MD, but a research MD. And he rushed over the last slides that he had, which was about 10 of them, and that was actually the interesting part of his course, where he was supposed to talk about Fukushima and Chernobyl and other issues, and talk about what radiation risk is and how to mitigate and all that stuff. And having looked at his slides, I probably didn't miss anything by him rushing. I probably know more than he does, because a lot of these people are actually taking the viewpoint that there is no actual risk from the peaceful use of radiation. This is a good example of an early slide. As you can see, as I noted, solar is not mentioned. Solar appears to be not mentioned in most of this course, except to trash it, which is interesting. So let's cut to the chase. Oil, coal, charcoal, wood. They produce particulate matter and other chemicals that poison the water, the land, and all creatures on the planet. We all know this. But they're vastly powerful and convenient energy sources, and most people want convenience over health. Now, wind. Wind has some applications in some places, but it's variable. It's either blowing or it's not. To power a medium-sized city, you would need vast quantities of windmills, which require concrete, which is a carbon polluter, and a whole bunch of other technologies to get them going. It's never going to be the #1 or even #3 power source for humanity in the current age. Geothermal, completely not mentioned. I would have liked geothermal mentioned because I think it actually is really an attractive power source in certain places depending on the rock formations and the ambient temperature. So why is solar vaguely mentioned? Solar is mentioned insofar as it points out that it takes huge acres of solar panels to generate power for a city. Okay, I said, so I put my hand up and said, but if you put them on existing roofs and new structures, doesn't that to a large extent mitigate the area size? You can't do that with windmills, you really can't. But you can with solar panels. So then later on they came up with the objection that most solar panels only last 5 to 10 years and are full of heavy metals, and there is no plan to deal with those heavy metals in solar panels. Environment Canada were also attending this, with which I was grateful. Environment Canada pointed out that most solar panels now last 25 years and drop to 95% efficiency of their original starting efficiency, which is about 40 to 45%. And I'm sitting there thinking, I don't really think you have a good plan to deal with nuclear waste either. And if you're going to bury these heavy metal solar panels underground, you might be able to do that a lot cheaper and easier and safer than burying radioactive inotropes. That's just me. So that's another case. We need energy. The more energy we have, the richer we are. Therefore, the better our standard of living. There was a discussion about what that actually means, and I think that's a reasonable discussion. Just because you have more money and more wealth and you're using more products doesn't necessarily mean you're a happier, more enjoyable lifestyle. Not necessarily, to some degree. But when they're talking about the use of energy, they were talking about how great energy is, but didn't mention any of the side effects of modern energy. Inequity, pollution. I could go on at length. I'll show you the slide. There you go, you can see my little notes on this, you can see what they were saying. There is no case at all, except in very radical green, to actually dismantle all of modern society and go back to living in mud huts. The real question is what's going to produce the energy we need for lights and everything else once fossil fuels are no longer used because of cost, actual price, or because of their actual bad effects. We've now got almost over 6 million people a year on the planet Earth dying from the effects of burning fossil fuels. This isn't rubbish, they say this as well. And that number's getting worse and worse and worse. And how many children now have asthma? And they don't have asthma because they're eating different types of cereals or Monsanto's evil, though I'd like to believe that. But really most of the children who are having asthma is because they're breathing in particulate matter in urban areas. Not all of them, but a lot of them. You can see from this one, I wrote quite a bit on it. Basically what they're claiming here is that we need more energy for the bigger population and to have a higher lifestyle. There was no discussion, there was no thought given to, can we actually manage in a humane and ethical way a reduction in human population, so therefore we can use more energy per person, but maybe use less as a species. Zero discussion on that, as per usual. Now I've said before, I'll say again, Canadians are power pigs, simple as that. We even make the Americans look fairly good. This is the energy consumption by sector in Canada. As you can see, transportation is by far the biggest sector and probably will remain so for a long time. As of now, we don't have decent electrical powered vehicles and certainly don't have decent electrical powered lorries and trains to actually transport the volume of goods that we require to maintain our current society. That hopefully will change over the next few years. Certainly if we were investing in much in that as we are in nuclear power, I would argue we'd probably be a long way along the road to that. Now along with car ownership, computer ownership, cell phone ownership and various other things like meat consumption, we are now at a tipping point. The tipping point has been reached. The rich people, the lucky few in the West, are now using as a percentage of energy on the planet less than the unlucky people who have terrible poor lifestyles, the people who don't live in the technical West. The reason they're using more power than us now is because there's so many more of them. On an individual per capita, per person level, they are still and remain using far less than us. But what they are doing is they're using more and more energy per capita, whereas most countries of the West, with some exceptions, USA, are actually using less and less energy. We're being more efficient with the energy we use, which is always a good idea considering there are wastes with all energy and there are costs with all energy. So there was zero talk about how to actually make more energy more efficient in Canada. There was no discussion about passive homes, there was no discussion about hubs for solar energy and wind energy and geothermal energy, there was no discussion about altering where people live to make them closer to work rather than far away from work because it's cheaper in the periphery. Now this is being done by scientists, right, physicists. Now as I pointed out, solar energy is nuclear energy, it comes from the sun. All energy on Earth derives from the sun in some form or other, except for perhaps geothermal, though there is an argument that geothermal came from the sun when the Earth coalesced, but not necessarily. Magnetic and tidal and pressure forces are actually what is generating a lot of the heat of geothermal energy, so that would be an argument for something that's possibly not solar, but then you could argue that the atoms of the materials involved inside the Earth are actually all from stars, so it is ultimately solar. So electrical use since 1971 has basically doubled in percentage terms across the planet Earth. It's much more than doubled in amount. But what is interesting with that is that the bottom line here is that energy remains, for most of us, a monopoly supplied industry. So there's a huge industry involved in creating national grids, there's a huge industry involved in providing power plants, there's a huge industry involved in charging the individual consumer for the use of the electricity. So anything that's going to rattle business normal, Uber if you like in terms of power, is going to be looked upon dimly by the electrical power companies. And the electrical power companies, by and large, are completely owning nuclear power. Now, nuclear power in Canada has about a 60,000 person workforce and is very well spread out across the country, except it isn't. Only the provinces of Ontario and New Brunswick maintain currently operating power plants that are nuclear based. Quebec had a really nice one that they closed down politically because they decided it wasn't worth poisoning their water supply if something went wrong. And Alberta refused to have them. There was some discussion about nuclear power being used to extract the tar sands, because then you wouldn't use half a barrel of oil, clean oil, to get 1 barrel of dirty oil. But that's a whole different discussion. But anyway, as it stands, only Ontario and New Brunswick are using nuclear power in all of Canada. America has got much more infiltration into their power grids from nuclear power than we do. They're using a different type of reactor down there as well. They're using a light water reactor, whereas we're using the CANDU reactor. We believe, we were told, that they have some advantages to CANDU compared to American light water reactor systems. I'm not going to get too heavy technical in that. The bottom line is, it sounded reasonable to me, but how do I know? These people are sort of biased into seeing CANDU as better than light water reactor. Now, when electricity goes through any system, currently a national grid, which isn't national, it's a transnational grid. I believe it affects Mexico as well, but it definitely is entwined between Canada and America. That power generation has to be 100% of maximum usage, or you need to be firing up extra power very quickly at times of use. You can't afford to have the actual voltages dropping throughout the system at any time, or you cause terrible damage. So their argument is that nuclear power is the clean way, the efficient way, the green way to provide most of that power, and then use supplementary liquid gas power stations for peak demand, with some hydro, with some wind. It barely mentions solar. I don't think they like solar. The problem with hydro in Canada is that we don't really want to dam any more rivers. It causes a terrible amount of damage to the environment of the river system, and we're not really keen on doing that. And all of the easily and cheaply available rivers to dam have pretty much been dammed, like Niagara Falls. Now, with increased human usage and various climate changes, the ability to dam rivers to provide electrical power over the world, generally speaking, is much less than it ever was. About 62% of all electricity generated in Ontario is nuclear power. All of my electricity generated is actually green renewable energy. I pay a supplement for that. But most people won't, and most people don't. But 62% is quite a lot. And their argument is that that model, the Ontario model, would be best spread throughout all of Canada and the rest of the world. Whereas the bottom line is, nuclear power, when they start a process, when they start a plant, has to actually put money aside for both the decommissioning of the plant and also for dealing with the waste. Currently, I was told they estimate there's 19 billion put aside for this. 9 billion for decommissioning and 10 billion for dealing with waste. That's not enough money if we have a Fukushima incident in a nuclear power station in Ontario or New Brunswick or the United States. Their argument is that safety is becoming more and more a thing in the nuclear industry and it won't happen. I find that hard to believe, and I'll tell you why. Their argument is that the risk industry for nuclear power is 1 in a million. So one of the things they said to us, if there's 10 doors and behind 9 doors is $1 million in cash for you and behind one door there's a guy with a gun who will shoot you dead, would you open the doors? Now, a surprising number of people in the room said yes to 1 in 10 odds of death. When it got to the 1 in a million, I was the only person left in the room and said no. And I'll explain why. The existential risk of extinction, death, compared to the possible joy of getting $1 million, the odds are always there that I might die. And I really like being alive, and I'm not going to risk my life to get $1 million. These people seem to think that's a fair transaction. 1 in a million risk is fine. I don't agree. They also said that over 17,000 years of cumulative nuclear power running, there's only been 3 major industry issues. Chernobyl, of course, and Fukushima, and they offered quite outstandingly low death rates for both of those, and then made some claims that have been debunked by quite a few people, so that's not going to work as an argument. Anyhow, that's going to be in the second video, because this is going to have to be a two-parter. There's quite a lot of detail on how we mine uranium, and how it's all very safe and everything else. That was kind of fun. Kind of enjoyed that. Taught me a lot of things about uranium mining I did not know, and now I know. So the CANDU reactors in Canada use non-enriched uranium, and they explain quite a bit about what that means. Pretty much all of the American reactors use enriched uranium. Their argument is that that costs far, far more for the fuel, although the fuel costs of nuclear power plants are actually very, very small compared to the rest of the fixed costs. But they also were implying that that's more of a dangerous thing to do. So I got to hold some uranium fuel pellets, and I got to hold a CANDU fuel bundle, and I got to hold some of the rods. So you can see those pictures, they were kind of fun. I would point out that they're actually mock-ups and they're not actually radioactive. One of the interesting things, and I really like how they put this, they said that the CANDU fuel bundle 200 years after extraction from the power station is actually something you can stand next to for a brief period of time and have no bad benefits from it in 200 years. But then when you look at how much fuel rods we're actually producing, and we're producing an enormous amount. Each of the CANDU reactors has 380 to 480 pressured rods inside it, and each of them have 6 CANDU fuel bundles. Now I'll show you the fuel bundle again. It weighs 49.5 kilograms fully loaded, because above 50 kilograms you're not allowed to lift it on your own in Canada, health and safety, so they designed it to be able to be lifted by one person. One of those fuel bundles would last me and Kitty about a year for our electrical power supply. So I think you can kind of figure out here we're generating a lot of waste, a lot of high radioactive waste. Very few percentage of that waste, it's about 3% of the actual waste, is high waste. So they use that as an example of why the nuclear power is fine. But any percentage of radioactive waste that can kill you dead if you're in the room with it in 20,000 years is going to be a disposal problem. Now we could send it to the Philippines and hope they don't notice, but technically what we're doing is we're storing it on site. We're trying to build a deep depository, a geological safe depository, and hopefully we can get going on that soon. I think of all the things we do, that's a good idea. We've got 3 sites now in Canada, and there's 5 Inuit and First Nations communities looking to have one of those 3 sites built in its neighbourhood, and that's why half of the people at this conference were actually First Nations. They're being funded by the federal government and nuclear power companies to actually come and attend stuff like this, to go back to their reserves and be ambassadors for nuclear power. See, I don't think it helps them to do stuff like this. I really don't. When you are talking about this and you just deliberately don't mention solar power whatsoever, cynics like me are always going to say, why not? Why not? Solar power cannot replicate how we power our homes and our businesses and our cars in 2019. What it can do is substantially reduce the amount of nuclear and backup power generation that's required. It also, if used properly, cuts out the monopoly electric supplier and makes the home owner or the business owner independent most of the time for electrical power use, and maybe even can sell some in a grid form to other people. So I understand why they don't like solar, because solar, I think, is actually the direct competitor of nuclear. Fossil fuels and coal powered stations, except in the heads of insane people, really need to be shut down. We all know that. Liquid natural gas may need to be kept going for occasional power boosts if we can't figure out other ways of doing that, i.e. lifting water when we have high production but low use, and then letting the water down to drive turbines when we have more power required than we can produce. So there's various things we can do. We're not doing any of it. What we're doing in Canada is spending a huge amount of money on nuclear power. Anyway, one bundle of the CANDO is actually 100 years worth of power for me and Kitty, not 1 year. But even so, there's a lot of me and Kitties in Canada. There's about 38 million people in Canada. The fact that each bundle lasts between 2 months and 18 months in the reactor before it needs to be replaced. And in Canada we don't reprocess nuclear fuel. And I used to live near Sellafield, previously called Windscale, and I think it's a good job we don't. Reprocessing nuclear fuel does increase the life of the fuel cell, but also produces some really, really nasty byproducts. So each CANDO reactor produces about 16 waste bundles a day. And I'm going to hold it here. The next video is going to talk a lot more about actual safety at nuclear plants and the implications of that, and it's also going to talk about some of the interesting ideas I came up with from the conference and the course about how to mitigate risks for me and for you if one of these unsinkable plants sinks. Remember, at SHTF, if you don't prep, tomorrow will always be worse than today. So get prepping. And part of prepping is to find some knowledge that's reputable and learn from it. And remember, always be skeptical about everything. And I'm not going to say right now what I think about nuclear power. I'm not going to say what I think we should do in terms of energy in Canada and America. It's really controversial, but I will definitely be addressing that in the next video, or the one after that. This could be a 3-parter. I hope not. Thanks for your patience. Have a great day. Toodles. This is just some pictures of the food I got. It was the best conference I've been to for food. Breakfast I was a bit limited. I could only get home fries and ketchup, and the bread was not vegan, but then I figured out how to use the hotel to get fruit and regular bread, so I did that the next day. They also gave me some great food. The first day was spicy stir fry, really good, vegan, and the next day I had noodle, which was spicy but not quite as spicy as the day before, with garlic bread. And it was kind of nice because most of the buffet food they provided actually was vegan, but they went out of their way to give me vegan food, which I appreciated. Hello, this is part 2 of my gripping series on the 2-day course I attended by the Canadian Nuclear Society on Nuclear Power 101, which is specifically designed to give people like me an overview of the nuclear power industry and actually to evangelize for nuclear power. But as we see from the opening titles, nuclear power has a bit of an image problem. First of all, I want to address risk. They made a big deal about hormesis theory, that small amounts of radioactivity is a stimulant and helps the human body be healthy. There is some research that does suggest that, but certainly once you get above 100 millisieverts, we start to have very, very bad reactions, both as a species and generally speaking on the planet. So we don't really want to introduce a substance that's going to produce over 100 millisieverts for us to take in without being very, very careful about it. So I don't know about you, but the level of risk I tend to use is the linear no threshold model, the LNT. This is any dose you get is an additive, the dose and the risk becomes additive with the dose, and there's no threshold for risk. I don't want any risk, like I don't want to take in anything that's going to cause me cancer. I'm not going to say a little bit's fine, I'm going to say I want no risk. And everybody's got the same risk. So they don't agree with that, and they kind of demolish that a little bit, but not that conclusively. In the hormetic model, dose is additive, we know that. The risk is not additive, so they're claiming that if you can go from 10 millisieverts to 20 millisieverts, you haven't got 10 plus 10 amounts of risk. Yeah, but certainly when you get to 100 millisieverts, going from an increase by 10 isn't the same as 0 to 10. It's the difference between life and death. Low dose may reduce risk. Well, maybe, we don't know. But again, we're natural creatures, and we're not all the same in respect to risk. Now, there are parts of the world that have huge amount of natural form radiation. They do sort of okay in those areas. That's the argument, that people genetically develop and animals genetically develop for those areas. Now, agreeing with the public perception, they use certain sound bites and they talk in certain ways. They talk about airline crew have melanoma skin cancer, but when it was studied it wasn't anything to do with the increased radiation that they get, which is considerable the transatlantic cruise. They claim it's entirely due, or at least they suggest it's entirely due to sunbathing at stops. That may not altogether be true. They use astronauts to show that there's no direct correlation with high background radiation and cancer. Again, I would like some more studies on that before I accept that. They say everybody's entitled to their own opinion but not their own facts, and that's true enough. But the facts are there's been multiple bad nuclear power peaceful use accidents that have caused huge stress and loss of life. Now they claim the loss of life is minimal, but they're not looking at various other factors, which I'm going to get into. So they use false evidence appearing real, FEAR, and I think this does have quite a bit of applicability to modern day life politics and even our sport and our hobbies. All radiation is harmful. Radiation only happens as a product of human activity. There's no good way to detect radiation. Radiation is the biggest cause of cancer. There is no safe way to work with radiation. Radiation radioactivity will cause cancer just by being near it. 1 million people will die because of Chernobyl. Now that's an interesting one. If you work with a parachute, the parachute is not dangerous to you. But if you jump out of a plane without a parachute, then it probably will be dangerous. If you drop a parachute out of a plane and it lands on somebody, then it's harmful. The risk of throwing the parachute out of the plane and hitting somebody on the head and killing them is fairly small. That does not necessarily therefore mean we should be going around throwing parachutes out of planes. So they have to prove a case. They have to prove that no matter what happens, worst case scenarios, the actual effects on humanity is much less than the effects that we would experience by not using nuclear power. Now, as I've said before, coal and oil, forget the climate change stuff, though that is significant in terms of human disaster and loss of life, but just by breathing those particulates in, we're losing probably about 600,000 to 1.6 million people a year at a conservative guess. This stuff is very hard to know specifically. So it makes a logical sense that if the cumulative risk year on year out is 1 million people die from nuclear power, the side effects of nuclear power by accidents and others, that's okay, because it's better than the alternative. And that's possibly true. And yet we also have alternatives called solar power and wind generation. They point out, and I thought it was kind of amusing, that people die constructing those panels by falling off roofs. They do. But unless they land on somebody, their effect on other people around them is reasonably limited. If a nuclear power station experiences Chernobyl or a Fukushima or a Windscale or a 3 Mile Island effect, and there's been others, it affects a lot more people, and those people get upset. Very upset. They claim 28 workers died from radiation poisoning at Chernobyl. They claim that 15 patients have died since Chernobyl in 1986 from thyroid cancer, and they claim there's a potential for 4,000 more thyroid deaths. That's fairly small in terms of what a coal power plant would do over that period of time. Other people using other facts have pointed to 1 million possible deaths. One of the things they haven't pointed to, and I didn't bring it up, was the fact that the Ukrainians have done their own scientific research, and when you look at death rates and birth rates across Northern Europe before and after Chernobyl, there's a very obvious reduction in births in the million range. So one can claim that the higher risk of, probably from Chernobyl, there was a lot of cesium, the risk of that is actually killing an unborn baby that would have been born alive. I think a lot of people would argue that's a death. They do not. And the fact that they claim 28 people only died in Chernobyl is kind of bizarre to me, given the fact of what we know. It wasn't the evacuation deaths, because the evacuation done very well. A lot of people died. Remember, in Belarus, they had people living there till 1999, fully 12 years after 1986, almost 13 years, living with incredibly dangerous amounts of radiation in their food, their water, and their air, and their soil, and in fact on their homes for a long time, and nothing was done about it. And there's clear evidence that there is an incredibly higher rate of mortality. And one of the things they also talked about, though they were cautious with that, was the huge beneficial effects from the loss of humanity around Chernobyl in terms of the wildlife. And yes, that is an effect, and yes, I've discussed it before, and it does appear at this point that the majority of animals that are living in Chernobyl have migrated in there from areas around where there are humanity. But the actual ability to maintain population base by breeding without radiation effects in the Chernobyl exclusion zone appears low. Nobody died at Fukushima directly from the radiation effects. There was a lot of people died from the tsunami. They claimed 2 died because of suicide. They claimed there was 28 deaths from accidental evacuations, and the premature deaths among evacuees was 764. That's kind of interesting. Now, Futobote Hospital was 4 kilometers from the reactor that exploded. Remember, there was more than one reactor that exploded. They did not really kind of mention that very much. 4 died during the evacuation out of that hospital, and then 40 died subsequently in the gymnasium they were placed in. That's fairly typical. When you have geriatric long-stay patients and you emergently evacuate them, they do tend to die. So despite being well up and versed in all of this stuff, they forgot to mention that the first definitively worker death from radiation exposure at Fukushima happened in September of 2018. The last date was taken by an educator who's got a science background, Larkin Moskrop, and she works with the nuclear power industry, and she titled her day Nuclear 101, Why the World Has Nuclear and Needs It Too. Case closed, okay? So she talks about the history of nuclear power in Canada, the fact that when the Clark River was decommissioned, that they threw it in sand because the idea at the time was dispersal, and that's why there's a tritium stream coming out of Clark River to this day. She talked about how safe it is and how people aren't really that bothered about it. It was all very, very reassuring. So the NRX reactor was built in 1944, started construction then, as part of the Manhattan Project to drop nuclear bombs on Germany. We ran out of time for that, but then on Japan. But there was a meltdown of that reactor, and that reactor was buried in sand, like I say. There's no discussion about long-term death rates from the workers involved in that because they probably didn't track it. And that again concerns me. But people die in the petroleum industry, people die in the trucking industry, people die in healthcare. The question is, the real question that the nuclear power industry has to answer is, can they avoid killing large numbers of people? And that's what they focus on. For me, the real question is, can they avoid removing millions of acres of fertile land from human production and animal use? That's the real question. Because if you are going to progressively have accidents, say we only have 1 accident every 100 years, and over 1,000 years we have 10 accidents, and each accident is like Chernobyl, I'm not sure that's a cost worth bearing if we can use wind and solar. They dismiss wind and solar. I'm not altogether convinced that the amount of money put into that is true. They actually put the generation of power for wind as the same cost as nuclear, but obviously is not as long and not as sustainable in terms of generation capacity. But solar was mostly, as I've said before, dismissed. We also seem to forget that humanity is not that smart. When they first built the CANDU reactors, the type of zirconium they used so they could put them in horizontally, which is better than anything else the world's got, even though the rest of the world's not really using that, actually rusted with the hydrogen. The hydrogen got into it and rusted it, and they almost had a disaster. But they found it, and then they switched to a different type of alloy, so that's fine. So I think that's the concern I think most people have, is this is very new technology. And new technology is worrisome if the risks become apparent during use. There was no suggestion, there was no talk that any risk from nuclear power had actually been uncovered prior to generation. And that for me is worrying. We're leaping ahead, we're doing all sorts of crazy things, and we'll get to that as well. Planes crash, it's never the plane manufacturer's fault, right? Always pilot error. They claim, the nuclear power industry, is also plagued by rubbishy humans making errors and causing pretty much all of the accidents. That may well be true, but I would also point out to you that we are people who make errors, and you can put in systems that are almost fail-safe, but to have a system that's totally fail-safe like they claim is not possible. Dumping 2 hours worth of cold water into a melting core and then assuming you can attach hose pipes to it and then just flush all this water out that's now highly radioactive for as long as it takes before you can pour concrete over it, I think isn't really the answer I want. There was some talk about constructing new power stations underground, so if there's an issue you can just cap it. It should already be capped with concrete anyway, because containment, you don't want it getting out, and then we could seal it up that way. So I think I'd be more happy with that. In a very non-windy area, nowhere near any water sources, I would be fine with that. But nuclear power requires a large volume of water. That's why they're built on the coasts. Not a great place to put them if you're worried about tidal waves, or sea level rise, or storms, or hurricanes. They're also built on river systems. Again, not a great thing to do. Numerous flooding we've had in the Ottawa River recently. Nuclear safety is across the industry. She pointed out that safety first, but we're a business, so you have to operate. Yeah, that's what worries me. If the governments are running it and they're not doing it for profit, but they're doing it for nuclear power generation, I'd be much more relaxed. Sorry, but I would be. Some things government's good with. But they use risk, as I've said before, of 1 in 1 million. And that's not acceptable to me. The risk from a Chernobyl in some place like where I live in Ontario is simply not acceptable. We need the power, and we've had very, very much focus on fossil fuels, which is destroying the climate, and our air we're breathing, and the water we're drinking. And we've also focused on nuclear power, which is a risk factor that could at some point bite us badly. We've really neglected solar. We've neglected wind. We've neglected geothermal. We've really neglected building passive solar houses. We've really neglected dropping our dependency on electricity by proving ourselves more resilient to both the hot and the cold of weather and climate. And I think that's a mistake. Of course, there's very little money to be made for corporations in those sorts of endeavours. A lot of money to be made in large mega projects. She happened to mention the full site evacuations practice every 5 years, and she says that they grab a snack and some water, then they sit in the car for 4 hours trying to get out of Chalk River when they do the full site evacuation. And that again is not that reassuring to me. If it's that bad that close, how bad would it be in any big town anywhere near it? And there's a lot of big towns in Canada near our remaining nuclear power stations. So under business normal, nuclear power is the best option. Absolutely no question about that. But unfortunately, business normal is operating waste. Waste is a free product in our economy, right? We don't pay for waste, traditionally. It ignores the risks and the costs of the inevitable accidents that will occur. It also ignores the fact that we have no reasonable plan at this point to actually handle high-risk nuclear radioactive waste. A lot of talk, a lot of planning, a lot of discussion, but we still have no actual ability to deal with high-risk nuclear waste. The low-risk waste is stored on site. Again, I'm not really that happy with that. I would like them to have a reasonable plan to make that stuff safe and away from me and the air I breathe and the water I drink and the food I eat until it's safe. There's no particular reason why we can't have asphalt tiles altered and new construction to have solar tiles. People are working on that. And we could also recycle solar panels. People are working on that. We can also make solar panels excellent and more efficient. People are working on that. They're not spending mega billions of dollars building them, though, are they? They're building nuclear power plants with the mega dollars from the government and the power corporations. Remember, corporations control the monopoly. The national grid has to stay intact because the people that own it make a lot of money from owning it. Say the audience was mostly industry insiders with about half First Nations there. But at one point, people did get agitated. She said, there's no solution for nuclear waste. That's the myth. Actually, we probably know more about nuclear waste and how to manage it than any other waste on the planet. And then she compared it to plastics. Yes, compared to plastics, yes. But that ignores the 10,000 years timescale of high-level nuclear waste where we're going to have death, miscarriages, and problems eating food. And the mayhem involved in a nuclear accident of that type of severity. Then again, there is no plan in place to deal with radioactive waste. other than store it at the site and hope we can build deep depositories, which we have not built. She also compared it to cyanide. She said gram for gram, cyanide is more deadly than radioactive waste. People had a lot of problems with that. And I think you can think why. They haven't home the point we need power. We're dependent on it in the West. You know, large parts of the world aren't dependent on a grid and they're doing just fine. And there's no particular reason why we have to have a grid in this day and age. But there's no discussion on decreased use. No discussion on efficient use. It's all about producing more power for more people because that'll make them richer, so we can resource steal more and more and more and have more people doing that, and there will be no problem, there will be no hard level at some point. And of course, nuclear power without a technological society would be a very scary thing for anybody to have to deal with, and with a technological society it's pretty scary as well. Is that radiation scary where you don't know how to control it or measure it? She says that's not true, and I agree with her on that. But you got to wonder, you just really got to wonder how good an argument that is. Just because we can measure the radiation and we know how to transport it and deal with it in peaceful ways, unless it escapes, in which case we gather it in big sacks and try and shove it somewhere we don't know where. That's not an argument for having increased radiation in the environment. It really isn't. It's an argument for being very careful about having that technology in the place. She claimed that for all new power stations, remember there are none in Canada, that the disposal and decommissioning is fully economically sourced and figured out before they start to build it. Environment Canada were present and told her quite clearly that is not true. She also claimed that the risk analysis and what we do to inhibit risk is also done for best case scenario. Environment Canada said that in all their dealings with the nuclear power station industry in Canada, cost was the predominant idea that they were dealing with when they were talking to power people about safety, minimising cost. This isn't a direct attack on nuclear power itself, but she pointed out that the research grants are held at arm's length from the power station producers and owners, so the research that's being done is untainted by bias. That's not true, as I've said before. If you are dependent on funding from the private sector to then get matching grants from the government, that will bias your topics, because if your topic is to show the nuclear power station should be closed down, I can guarantee the nuclear power industry is not going to fund you. So there's a whole big section on the future of nuclear power, and basically the future is going to be radioactive, if you pardon the pun. That's what I wrote down. But they talked about different types of reactors they're looking at. All of them are kind of like freaky to me, like sodium reactors and stuff like that, where you use liquid sodium as a coolant and the transportation medium. That really scared me. Sodium is quite volatile when in contact with water or oxygen. It's a fun talk, and what they basically focused on, not in great detail but I highlighted more, is nuclear power has now sort of not given up on the idea of the Fukushima-sized power plants, 3 Mile Island plants. Although they're being built all across the world, what Canada's doing now, we're looking at making reactors, nuclear power reactors, that are basically the size of a truck, so they can be trucked into First Nations areas and give them power. Sounds great. Certainly there would be a need for that. There wasn't any discussion about transportation safety or decommissioning or what we're going to do with these reactor cores and all the rest of it, and who's going to actually service them. That was interesting. They also said that these reactors, once developed, because remember we're going to take a lot of money from the government, from taxpayers, to pay for the research for this, they are then going to be able to be sold to places like Africa, which isn't a place, it's a continent, and I wish people would get over themselves with that one. But one of the 47 countries or 48 countries of Africa can buy Canadian reactors that are the size of trucks, and then they can just bring in more reactors and add them together if they need more power, and that would give power to all large parts of the continent of Africa, which would be a great thing because they'd be able to consume more and they'd be richer. If there's no limits to growth, that's true. If there is no risks providing radioactive isotopes in large amounts to foreign countries, if there's no risk of disposal or issues with permafrost stability in Canada's north. Final quote was absolutely wonderful. I know it's sure because I put her email on it. Our analysis demonstrates that realising nuclear energy's potential is essential to achieve a deeply decarbonised energy future in many regions of the world. Possibly. The quote's actually from a guy from TEPCO. That's Tokyo Power, who own Fukushima. Well, you enjoyed that. I enjoyed the course. It taught me a lot that I didn't know. It taught me a lot I did know. And I do remain committed to the prospect of a nuclear powered future. I think it is an important adjunct, but I really don't want it in the hands of private corporations. I think it's ludicrous to have private corporations making profit and using nuclear power for profit in a situation where if they cut corners and it goes wrong, hundreds of thousands to millions of people are going to have to leave their homes and never go back, or not go back for years. That strikes me as just simply stupid. It's such a national security risk for each country that has nuclear power stations. It really should be controlled by the government, and we shouldn't be seeking to reduce costs by making it private. Now, maybe a bit socialist yet, but that's what I think. Anyway, enjoyed the course. Toodles.
In March of 2011, this accident was caused by the tsunami shutting down the power. So, interestingly, the owners of the Fukushima Daiichi plants were found negligent. They had been told to upgrade some of their systems, so their generators needed to have some upgrades. They did not do those upgrades to the generators. Meaning that when the tsunami hit and we shut down all of our generators, then we had inadequate cooling of our reactor. So the country in the world has a mandate for a geological repository if they have nuclear program. We are working on our deep geological repository right now with the NWMO. And it is a way of storing waste in a safe environment, in a safe state for a long period of time.